Meanwhile, in Egypt, President Mubarak hangs on in there in naked defiance of the popular will and the White House, which in time-honored fashion has turned its back on one of America's oldest allies at the first hint of trouble. The consequences for Egypt and the Middle East are momentous, and to discuss them, I brought into the studio two MPs who are experts on the region. Robert Halfon, who worked for the Conservative Friends of Israel before entering Parliament, and one of the grand old men of British politics, the Lib Dem Sir Ming Campbell. First of all, I asked Ming Campbell whether he agreed with critics who are accusing the Foreign Secretary William Hague of failing to rise to the level of events.
Well, there was a lot of concentration on how we were going to get British citizens out. But remember, the government's been criticised in the past for not being sufficiently agile when issues of that kind arise. But the difficulty which the government has, and the difficulty which they have in Washington too, is that there's been an ambiguity in our policy towards Egypt for a very long time. We've put stability and energy supply, that's in the region generally, above issues of human rights and democracy. And when these issues suddenly come to the top of the pile, then perhaps it's not surprising that we find grave difficulty in responding to them. But the progress of events now in Egypt and their consequences for other parts of the Middle East obviously demand a thoroughgoing review of British policy towards that most important and potentially explosive region.
Robert Halfon, do you accept the criticisms that William Hague, the Foreign Secretary, has not really risen to the level of events over the last week or so?
No, I don't. Don't forget, as an MP, you get besieged by emails from anxious constituents who are worried about people in Egypt who are holidaying. So it's inevitable, especially given the pressure of the media and the opposition, that the government have to focus on whether or not British citizens are going to be safe. Having said that, I do believe that we need a radical reappraisal of British foreign policy and to look towards supporting genuine democratic reformist groups in Arab countries, because for too long we've often been on the side of regimes like Mubarak in the cause of stability, and not enough has been done to support genuine democratic movements.
One important thing, I believe, is not to think of the Middle East as if it's a homogenous bloc. There are different regimes in different countries which have operated a different kind of government. And if you take Saudi Arabia, for example, there's been very little political activity of an opposition nature. Because of the enormous oil wealth, huge sums have been spent on health and education, providing jobs for people. So long as that goes on, the suggestion is that there may not be the kind of outburst of determination for democracy that we've seen in Egypt. Another country is Jordan, where the anxiety has not been about political development, but the cost of food and the presence of corruption.
I think there are two very fundamental questions here, and that is whether or not we are looking at 1977 or whether we're looking at 1989, i.e. Iran or Eastern Europe. I think it's probably somewhere in between. I don't think it's Eastern Europe. I think most of the demonstrations are because of the terrible economic situation and the hunger that these people have. But nevertheless, there are Islamists in the background. And the second important question is, what is democracy? Is democracy just about overthrowing a dictatorship? Is it just about elections? Or is it about genuine human rights, religious tolerance, property rights, rule of law and equality towards women? And if those countries move from dictatorships to genuine democracies, as I've just described, then we really will have made some progress.
I think it's important not to try and draw too many parallels from previous revolutions. An important component of what we've seen in the last week or so in Egypt has been nationalism. And remember, it was nationalism which fueled, going back in history, Nasser's successful effort to take over the country, to nationalize the Suez Canal, to adopt a very anti-Western policy. And a lot of the comments that you've heard from people in the square have been about, we are Egypt, we are proud. And nationalism, undoubtedly, is at the forefront of a lot of the political attitudes which we've seen expressed. Now, unbridled nationalism can be a very, very corrosive force if what you're looking for is stability and democracy. And I think we would do well not to bet the farm that what was going to come out of Egypt is going to be a liberal democracy of a Western description.
Well, but Halfon, you travel to Israel a great deal. You talk to the leadership there. I mean, how would they react if Egypt did become a Muslim Brotherhood-dominated state and, say, the borders of Gaza were opened and all the other consequences that might flow?
Well, who knows is the answer to that, because Netanyahu, I think, was quoted in the Israeli parliament over the last couple of days saying that Israel will not hesitate to take all the necessary measures. What those measures will be, we just don't know. I think there will be a lot of anxiety as to what will happen if the Gaza borders open completely. I mean, we already have the problem with the smuggling of weapons through the tunnels. I think that will cause a serious situation. Interestingly, having said that, if the Gaza borders were open completely, I suspect many of the Palestinians who don't like the Hamas regime would flee back to Egypt anyway. So it's impossible to say. The only thing we can say is that the setbacks to moves towards peace will be enormous.
Robert Halfon and Ming Campbell.